can resume.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Shustov, can you hear me?
Yes.
Dr. Shustov, you just went outside the hotel where you are and spoke with plaintiff's counsel about your testimony, correct?
I just talked to the counsel about how our process is going, and I didn't talk about my testimony.
Well, Dr. Shustov, isn't it true that Ms. Forgy was on a phone conversation with plaintiff's counsel here in the courtroom while you were standing outside of the hotel?
I have no idea what she was, who was she calling or what she was doing. I was eating the Snickers bar and drinking coffee outside the hotel.
Okay.
I have no idea.
I'd like to pull up, Your Honor, a photo. I guess Dr. Shustov won't be able to see it, but if I can put it in the record as Exhibit 11. We might not have it. But Dr. Shustov, isn't it true that you were told on the break to say that not all potential risk factors are substantial contributing factors?
No, we did not have that conversation.
Okay. Isn't it true, Dr. Shustov, that you were told that I was specifically going to show you 5 to 6 studies?
I do not recall specifically Ms. Forgy telling me that you're going to pull 5 or 6 studies. She mentioned that you might have papers that are not in my report. That's my recollection, just outside the room.
So you were discussing some of your testimony with Ms. Forgy?
Outside.
Well, could you repeat your answer? I'm sorry, you were cut off.
I just specifically said what Ms. Forgy told me, that you might have literature about hepatitis that is not in my report.
Okay, but I just want to be clear. Is it your testimony under oath that on the break you did not discuss with plaintiff's counsel the content of your testimony? Beyond that?
Beyond that, the only thing that I asked Ms. Forgy is how is my testimony and how the discussion is going.
Okay. And your testimony, she didn't say anything about clarifying things about potential risk factors or substantial contributing factors?
I don't recall that.
And if we can just pull up the photo and admit it quickly as Exhibit 11, and then we'll go to hepatitis C. You can see it on the screen now. And Your Honor, I'll just put on the record that multiple attorneys, both in Seattle and here in the courtroom, heard discussions about between, here we heard lawyers here talking to lawyers there about things Dr. Shustov should say, and there we heard Dr. Shustov talking about the specifics of his testimony with plaintiff's counsel. And I will move on.
No, Your Honor, you can see I'm here alone right now, and I can tell you that whoever Ms. Forgy is talking to on that phone was not me, so I have no idea when this was taken or what she's done, but this is completely ridiculous.
Okay, well, if it's completely ridiculous, then it doesn't matter if the photo is admitted, so it's admitted.
Okay. Dr. Shustov, let's talk about hepatitis C. First, it's your testimony that there's no evidence that Mr. Hardiman ever had chronic hepatitis, correct?
I have not found anything in Mr. Hardiman's record to document persistence of the virus or viral particle in his system. That would be a definition of chronic hepatitis C.
Hepatitis C is a persistent presence of the virus in an individual, correct? Active virus, correct?
Chronic hepatitis C is the typical syndrome that includes persistence of the virus, persistent activity of the virus,
Right, and
Mr. Hardiman's liver test never showed any significant abnormalities for me to suspect that he has clinically significant inflammation for hepatitis virus. Neither I saw any testing to suspect that there was continuous replication of hepatitis virus.
right, but you only had his medical records since 2005, correct? That was the first date that you had a medical record for Mr. Hardiman was in 2005, correct?
That sounds right. I would have to look his records, but it sounds about
right. And he could have had. Well, let's just look at what the medical records say. Can you turn to tab 15 and let's not please do not pull this up on the screen, but the court can look. There's a motion in limine that's subject to this medical record. And do you have tab 15 in the exhibits binder in front of you? This is in volume 1, tab 15. We'll make this exhibit 12. And it talks about, and I don't want to read the whole thing because of the motion in limine. If the court's okay with that, that would be acceptable to me, Your Honor.
And at least at first glance, it seems like it might be appropriate for some or all of this to be under seal, so it's fine to have it provisionally under seal for now. Okay. Okay.
But Dr. Schustoff, for our purposes here, Dr. Ruffner-Statzer, that's the doctor who treated Mr. Hardiman's hepatitis C in 2005, correct?
That's correct.
And she notes a history of hepatitis and then says 1966, correct? I'm looking under the progress notes about 5 lines down. And I'm just reading history of hepatitis 1966. Do you see that? Dr. Schustoff, can you hear us?
Yes, I can, very well.
Sorry, we couldn't hear your answer, but do you see where it says history of hepatitis 1966?
Yes, I do. History of hepatitis 1966, unclear what type.
Okay, and then it lists a series, and I don't want you to read them out loud, but it lists a series of risk factors for hepatitis that occurred in Mr. Hardiman's life between 1966 and 1969. Do you see that?
I do.
And those, in fact, are risk factors for hepatitis C, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then if you turn to tab 17, which we can mark, please, as exhibit 12, 13.
Tab what? Sorry.
Tab 17, Your Honor.
That's fine. I have to say the parts I read didn't seem like they should be under seal, but or the part that we just looked at didn't seem like it should be under seal. But for now, I'm fine with it, with this and this exhibit and the last one being provisionally under seal.
And this, Dr. Schustoff, is another record from November 2005, and it notes in the diagnoses hepatitis C, chronic, correct?
I see that.
And above that, it also notes cirrhosis of liver, right?
I see that.
And you agree that hepatitis C can cause cirrhosis of liver, right?
In some patients it can. It's not the only factor that can cause cirrhosis, but it can.
Right. One factor is extensive alcohol use, correct?
Another possible factor, yes.
And there's no evidence that Mr. Hardiman extensively used alcohol in his life, correct?
Based on my conversation with him, and I would go back to his medical records, he did have exposure was used alcohol was that significantly prior to enlisting into the military, and he continued to drink modestly afterward. If you want me to go to my report, I think I documented that.
Okay, well, we can look at...
I believe what he told me without looking at my report, that prior to enlisting in the military, he had more substantial use of alcohol and with his girlfriend, and then it subsided significantly just before and obviously after he enlisted into the military.
Okay, well, you agree that when hepatitis C is a cause of cirrhosis of the liver, it takes decades for that cirrhosis to develop, correct?
I think decades would be the average time, and every particular person, it could be faster, or some people could be longer than that. In medicine, we operate things called median time. So the median time is long, but what it means is by that time, half the patient develops cirrhosis, but half would have developed cirrhosis much earlier than that, or much later.
Okay, and then quickly, if you flip the page, I just want to look at the ICD-9 code that his doctors listed for chronic hepatitis C. You see on the top of page 82, it's the ICD-9 code is 070.54A. You see that?
Okay.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to admit, Your Honor, if it's okay for the record, tabs 18, 19, 21, 22, and 23, 24, which all show a diagnosis of chronic hepatitis C, if we can make that a cumulative exhibit. Okay, now Dr. Shustov, if you can turn to the scientific literature binder before I sit down in my last 2 minutes or so, I just want to go over a very few studies with you. Can you turn to tab 17 of that binder? And you see that this is a study by Dr. Giordano titled Risk of Non-Hodgkin Lymphoma, and it goes on in U.S. veterans with hepatitis C virus.
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, now turn to the second page. There's a section that says study patients infected and uninfected with HCV. Do you see that?
The second page, which column? Oh, yes, I do see it.
Okay, and do you see 4 lines down that the authors list the ICD-9 diagnosis codes that they used for specifying HCV infection, and that one of them is 070.54, the exact code that we just saw from Mr. Hardiman?
Yes, I do see that, and to me, it is not a reliable way of identifying objects with chronic hepatitis. Diagnostic codes or billing codes. And it has stayed more than that from treating physician records for the chronic hepatitis. I have no reason to dispute it, but it is fine with had chronic hepatitis. I would have to review the source documents. Why this physician made that determination. So with absolute respect for the treating physician, in medicine, for me to opine on the disease, I would have the source documents. Just like I would expect that physicians who see my patients would not take
Okay, so I understand you have criticisms of this paper, but you didn't even consider this paper in your report, right?
This was not the basis of my report.
Okay, and I just want to quickly look at the conclusions on the first page. It says, hepatitis C virus infection confers a 20 to 30% increased risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And then it goes on to say, these results support an etiological role for HCV in causing lymphoproliferation and causing non-Hodgkin lymphoma. That's what it says, correct? Did I read that correctly, Dr. Schustoff?
I'm verifying that. Just 1 second. Yes, I see what you just read.
Okay. And, Your Honor, just for efficiency, I'm happy to ask Dr. Schustoff, or is it possible to just introduce 2 other studies for Your Honor? I'm happy to just sort of introduce them to you and show you the. Okay, thank you. Dr. Schustoff, can you please turn to tab 10 in the same binder?
I'm here.
Okay, and this is a study by Dr. D. San Jose. Do you see that? And then others, of course.
Yes, I do.
Okay, so let's first just look at the background and aims on page 1. It says, increasing evidence points toward a role of hepatitis C virus infection in causing malignant lymphomas. We pooled case control study data to provide robust estimates of the risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma subtypes after HCV infection. Do you see that?
I do.
You also didn't consider this study in offering your opinions about Mr. Hardiman, correct?
What you're asking me to do is judge my opinion by pulling one sentence out of a 15-page paper. As a academician, I cannot either agree or disagree with this. I would have to read, and if you ask me specific questions about the conclusions. Writing papers myself, reviewing papers, I cannot just take for granted the conclusions that you made. I would have to look if I have any criticism or whether what's published in this paper specifically pertains to Mr. Hardiman.
Dr. Schustoff, if I could interrupt with you on a couple of points. One is, my sense is that it's possible that the sound is going in and out when you move around a lot. That it may be possible that if you try to stay still, we will lose sound less frequently. I know that's hard because that's not how normal people talk, but do your best. The second thing is, I think that the question was, did you rely? I think it's a yes or no question. Did you rely on or consider this paper in connection with the conclusions you reached about Mr. Hardiman? Not whether you agree with this paper or not, simply whether you considered it or relied on it.
Okay, and just quickly, if you look at page 2 under materials and methods, and if you go 5 lines down, it says studies, so they're pooling studies, and it says studies were required to have used the 3rd generation enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay test for HCV. Do you see that? And that, Dr. Schustoff, means that patients who were part of these studies were not required to have active HCV infection to be included in the study at the time of their cancer diagnosis, correct?
I would have to read this in more detail before I make any type of statement.
Okay, well, the 3rd generation enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay doesn't tell you whether someone has active RNA, active viral load. It just tells you whether someone has been exposed to hepatitis C at some point, correct?
I cannot answer this question again without reading what specific assays I used to study,
Okay, so one last thing on this study. On page 5, under discussion, third line down, I just want to read that sentence or 2 sentences into the record. Our results show increased risks of DLBCL and other lymphomas associated with HCV infection. These risk estimates were particularly robust for DLBCL, with a 2-fold increased risk overall and a statistically significant increased risk observed in 3 of the 7 studies. That was the conclusion of the authors, correct?
I see their conclusion. Again, to support this, as a academician, I would have to read exactly what the results in the paper have stated, not just the conclusion. Whether I have any criticism or any flaws that the study contained that might or might not be relevant to the plaintiffs. And I want to also add that I'm not questioning the general causation of hepatitis and lymphomas, but in my report, I use my judgment based on all my knowledge, whether in a particular case the plaintiff hepatitis C had or had not been a substantial contributing factor.
Right, but you made clear at your deposition that you part of the basis for ruling out hepatitis was that there was no evidence that Mr. Hardiman had chronic hepatitis, right?
There's no evidence that he had persistent of viral activity in his system for 8 years prior to diagnosis.
Right, but he may have had it for 40 years, from 1966 until 2006, correct?
He might have had it, but I don't have to get any source documents to prove this to me. And I make my conclusion, and that goes to the strength of whether in the test results that the existence of the virus for I cannot dispute it. I just don't have anything to support that.
Right. In other words, in ruling out hepatitis C in Mr. Hardiman's case, you, because you didn't have a record, ignored the possibility that he had active hepatitis C for 40 years that also led to him having cirrhosis in his liver. You didn't consider that because you didn't have a record that said it, right?
I did consider it. I did not ignore it. I just medical records available to me did not support or did not provide any proof to me that Mr. Hardiman had persistence of the viral activity, whether before or after he was treated with interferon. Excuse me. I'm not disputing his physician's statement. As another physician, I need to see the source document based on which the treating physician made that determination.
One last study, and then I'll be done, Your Honor. If you can turn, please, to tab 22, Dr. Schustoff. Okay, and this is a study by Dr. Mahali. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And, excuse me, do you see this? Actually, turn to page 2 where it talks about conclusions. And do you see that it says risks of several EHMs? What are EHMs?
I don't know what the EHMs are. Let me look at the abbreviation. Okay, I see that. Extrahepatic manifestation.
Okay, of HCV, and that would include lymphomas like NHL, correct?
I'm not so sure that it means secondary cancers as extrahepatic manifestations. To me, without looking at the paper, what extrahepatic manifestations are clinical syndrome of hepatitis in other organs, like hepatitis C-induced kidney disease, hepatitis C-induced so-called cryoglobulinemia.
Well, your testimony, bless you, is essentially that because I think the judge asked you questions about this in the context of latency. I mean, your testimony was that because his hepatitis C was treated for the 8 years prior to Mr. Hardiman's development of NHL, that is what led you to rule out hepatitis C, correct?
But maybe to rule out hepatitis C or call it unlikely is the fact that after the treatment, there was no evidence on years and years of testing that there was evidence of replication of the virus anywhere in Mr. Hardiman's system. If he had hepatitis C replicating in any of his organs, the very sensitive molecular techniques that you just mentioned, it would detect viral particles in the blood of the patient, whether it's liver or extrahepatic. And that's what I based my conclusion on, that for 8 years, continuous testing by the physician you mentioned did not show any evidence of activity of the virus at a very sensitive molecular level.
Right, so just to clarify, he did not have evidence of active virus, according to you, between 2006 and 2015, correct?
I have not seen or do not recall any test that would suggest that he has replication of the virus in that period of time.
Right, and that's because he was treated between 2005 and 2006 with interferon-based antiviral therapy, right?
It might have been the major factor that either eliminated the virus or made it non-active for all those years.
Right, and what I want to now go back to the Mahali study. What the Mahali study says, if you look back at the conclusions, is that, however, early initiation of AVT may be required to reduce the risk of, and it specifically specifies, NHL, correct?
Okay.
So if Mr. Hardiman, and I understand that you say you can't tell, but if Mr. Hardiman had HCV since the 1960s, active virus, and then he wasn't treated until 2005, what the Mahali paper tells us is that that interferon, that antiviral therapy, may not reduce his risk of developing NHL, correct?
No, it is not what it tells us. It tells us that the treatment of hepatitis early might reduce the risk of NHL because there is less time of persistence. There is a bit of time where the virus is persisting in somebody's body to pose the risk of lymphoma. It does not tell us that after elimination of the virus that it's at risk.
Right, and Mr. Hardiman wasn't treated with that interferon until 2005, correct?
That is correct.
And we have a debate about whether he was exposed since the 1960s and had the active virus that led to his cirrhosis for 40 years, right?
Correct. So the debate is, and what I'm trying to opine on, that even if he had hepatitis C virus prior to 2005 for many years, he did not develop lymphoma at the time. Once he eliminated virus or activity of the virus in his system in 2005, it is highly unlikely that 8 years later he developed the lymphoma. If you told me that he had persistence of hepatitis C virus for many years, and while he had persistence, he developed the lymphoma, my opinion most likely would be different. Because as I stated before, based on how viruses cause transformation of lymphocyte into lymphoma, it requires persistent viral activity to cause changes in the cells that make them different from basic cancer. And what this conclusion tells me, that it's a persistence of the virus, how long it lasts, puts people at the risk of developing NHL, and the sooner you treat it, the less persistence of the virus you have, it eliminates or reduces the risk of those complications.
But I just quickly want to use one analogy. Someone can smoke for 15 years and then stop smoking and then develop lung cancer 15 or 20 years later, correct?
That would be questionable at this day and age whether smoking had, how much smoking had to do with this, because as I stated in my report, the very intriguing findings of lung cancer research indicate that the way that smoking causes lung cancer
Well, you agree that the
Okay, it's time to wrap up.
Yeah, that's right. Well, one last question. You agree that the latency period for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma can be decades, correct?
The latency, as we discussed, means different things when you talk about viral agent and chemical exposure or simple chemical. The latency for viruses, I do not dispute that, but the latency for viruses would mean that we have to have persistent viral activity for all those years to put patients at high risk of developing lymphoma. So that's viral latency. The latency for chemical exposure is different. You don't have to have chemicals left in your body because it is based on DNA damage. And then the latency persists or risk persists despite the fact that the chemical is out of the system. It's just such a dramatic difference in how viruses and chemicals cause transformation into cancer.
Your Honor, can I just move? I'm sorry that I've lost track of exhibit numbers, but can I just have tab 10 and tab 22 marked as exhibits? Sure. I got a note that I didn't. So okay, sorry. Okay.
Thank you. Ms. Wagstaff, before you do your very, very quick redirect, let me just explore something briefly with Dr. Shustak. Let me just be as transparent as I can be with you about the concern that I have with your opinion. And it goes back to the issue that I was asking you about earlier, where I said, once you determine that somebody has exposure to glyphosate above the floor, does that automatically mean that it was a substantial factor in causing the NHL? And you said, well, no, not automatically, right? You still have to conduct your analysis. But I think I took you to be saying that unless some overwhelming factor entered into the analysis, some significant overwhelming factor entered into the analysis, we would conclude that the glyphosate exposure was a substantial factor in causing the NHL. Did I state that correctly?
You did, Your Honor.
What? I did? Okay. And the analogy might be, all right, somebody smoked moderately for a period of time, right? And they got lung cancer. And normally, if we found out that somebody smoked for a moderate period of time and then they got lung cancer, unless something overwhelming came in, we would conclude that the smoking was a substantial contributing factor to their lung cancer. Something overwhelming might happen, like you might learn that they worked every day for 50 years in an asbestos mine, and then we might say, well, maybe then we would conclude that it wasn't the smoking, but it was the asbestos. I don't know. But and that makes sense in the context of the cigarettes and the asbestos example to me, because the evidence is so strong that tobacco, that smoking causes lung cancer, right? There is no dispute about, as a matter of general causation, that smoking causes lung cancer, and the evidence is overwhelming. In contrast, with glyphosate, whatever anybody wants to say about general causation, the evidence of a link between glyphosate and cancer is much, much, much weaker than the evidence of a link between smoking and cancer, okay? And so the way you describe it, it sounds like you are not taking the relative weakness of that evidence, of that general evidence, general causation evidence, into account when you are conducting your analysis. It sounds like you're treating the glyphosate, once it's crossed the threshold into risk factor, you're treating it no differently than you would treat cigarettes in my example. And it on the surface, to me anyway, that sounds like a real problem with your analysis, because it may be that we haven't identified any other factor that is overwhelmingly likely to have caused somebody's NHL, right? But the evidence that glyphosate caused the NHL might still be kind of weak. And so the conclusion might be, we simply don't know what caused this person's NHL, right? Maybe if you put a gun to my head and you asked me to identify the factor that was most likely to have caused the NHL, I might say glyphosate based on the evidence, but I still don't have a lot of confidence that the glyphosate caused the NHL. And it seems to me that nuance, that the sort of the difference in the strength of the general causation evidence and the relative weakness of the general causation evidence with respect to glyphosate did not enter your analysis, such that it caused you to almost automatically assume that it was caused by glyphosate if we don't have some other overwhelming factor that enters the equation. And that seems problematic to me, and so I wanted to sort of articulate that as best I can and ask you to respond to it.
Sure. Thanks, Ron. I would say your statement have validity, and I was not asked to opine on strength of general causation evidence. But I would say in my defense that in causing cancer and how understanding how cancer in the cell develops, we operate what we call multi-hit hypothesis, where in the same patient, it does not have to be the single factor causing NHL. And even if say, for the sake of argument, and this patient all had persistent HCV infection, or HPV infection, where it's I cannot rule it out. To me, the HCV infection and glyphosate exposure are not mutually exclusive factors, because if you told me that a person has HCV, I have to dismiss glyphosate as a factor. I would say, well, you're implying that somehow you protected this patient from glyphosate toxicity. So in my mind as a biologist, still a former physician, those are non-competing factors, but actually symbiotic factors, if you wish, to further increase somebody's risk of developing itself. I give you, say, for the sake of discussion, all of the plaintiffs, or one of them, had persistent HCV infection, and at the same time also was treated with radiation therapy for, say, breast cancer. Then I would say, I cannot rule out the radiation, I cannot rule out the hepatitis infection, but it does not mean that it dismisses the contribution that glyphosate can have.
Well, I understand, sorry to interrupt, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure how responsive it is to the concern that I'm expressing. Because the concern that I'm expressing is your analysis does not seem to take into account how strong or how weak the evidence is of a link between glyphosate and NHL in the first place. And I would think, again, I'm not the expert, but I would think that if I were crafting a specific causation opinion, or in other words, if I were looking at a patient and trying to assess how likely it is that the disease was caused by X versus Y, I wouldn't merely want to identify certain things as a risk factor or not a risk factor. I would want to assess how strong the risk factor is. And it kind of sounds from everything you've said here today that all you've done is asked whether glyphosate passes a certain threshold such that it can be classified, generically speaking, as a risk factor without assessing how strong of a risk it is.
Your Honor.
Yeah, that is correct. I was not asked to opine on strength of association. That, in my opinion, was maybe I'm wrong about this. Is in the realm of general causation, whether it's 2x or 5x increase in the odds ratio. My main basis for excluding it as a factor was the understanding of general
and I understand that, and I understand the limitation on what you were called upon to provide. But I guess my further question is, how useful is a specific causation opinion in a context like this, where you haven't really assigned any weight to the risk? You've merely sort of decided that it's a risk.
Well, again, the reason it's a risk is based on generalization before. I did not really try to muscle between this risk factor and glyphosate or hepatitis C glyphosate, because in my mind they work together to potentially increase further on each other's risk. So I did not really assign the level of risk for each particular factor, because they're not mutually exclusive.
When you, in your other cases, I don't know how often you've been called upon to provide a medical causation opinion, but in prior cases, have you been asked only to provide specific causation opinions, or have you been asked to provide both specific and general causation opinions? Or to put it another way, have you, in prior cases, have you been asked to distinguish between the two, or have you simply been asked, to provide basically an opinion on whether this particular thing caused this disease in this patient?
The only other litigation I was involved in my entire career was the Intel case, and my recollection is that I was asked to opine whether the use of certain medications have contributed substantially to the case. I honestly do not recall, was it under the realm of general causation specific, but my involvement with that case was to opine on that particular patient. So, and that's the only case outside current litigations I was ever asked to opine on the patient.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
All right, I just have a few follow-up questions. One, just following up on what the court just asked you. There was a lot of testimony about the floor. I think that's a phrase that Monsanto's lawyer created after using the goalposts of Erickson and McDuffie of the 2 days per year or 10 days per lifetime. Do you remember that conversation from earlier?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, and I think you opined on this, but I just want to make sure the record is clear. And you said this, but again, in case the transcription didn't come across and the judge has invited us to repeat it if it's important, you just used those thresholds to rule in Roundup, and then you actually looked at the exposure of the particular plaintiff, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so playing off a little bit of what the court was just asking you, you did consider the strength of the risk factor based on the type of or the amount of exposure, and you testified earlier that each of these three plaintiffs far exceeded the floor threshold required, right?
To this specific question,
Overruled.
Answer is the exposure for plaintiffs far exceeded the threshold that I mentioned. And let me also clarify one thing. When we do this analysis here in our clinical trial assessments for finding certain risk, statistically you have to determine where you make a cut. Say, who do you call older patients and younger patients? Understanding that the age is not a bivariate, it's not a variable, but it's a continuous variable. And we artificially create these thresholds where we look at what happens before and after. In the mind of the biologist and lymphoma physician and lymphoma researcher, the single exposure can pose the risk of transforming cells into cancerous or precancers. It all depends on whether the DNA sequence that hit imposed the lesion. Remember that normal cells, all our cells have 80-90% blank DNA, where the mutations do not cause any harm. And the amount of exposure in the mind of the biologist, or in my opinion, only matters as far as
Okay, so you used your clinical judgment then in weighing the risk factor in your differential diagnosis, right? The risk factors.
Well, I used the clinical judgment.
We know the. I'm sorry to interrupt. We know the answer to that question.
Okay, so the answer is yes. So if you'll turn to number 22 in Monsanto's Exhibit 3, which is the Mahali literature. I don't know if Mr. Steckloff put this in the. Okay, Exhibit 14. What is sustained virologic response, SVR?
So sustained virologic response is the definition where after treatment of viral disease, in this case hepatitis, the evidence of this virus in the hepatitis disappears, but it's not just one point in time. It has to be sustained over either 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, and those parameters are established specifically for every type of viral infection. So it not only has to make virus go away, but it responds completely over a prolonged period of time.
Okay, so, and this is important, so you said that the sustained virologic response must mean that the viral load is 0 for, I think you said 6, 12, 18 months, so let's just use 2 years. Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay, and you've testified earlier that Mr. Hardiman had a viral load of 0 for 8 years, right?
Since his treatment with interferon, he did not have any detectable virus.
Okay, so I think you could agree that Mr. Hardiman was in a sustained virologic response from Hep C, right?
That is correct. And I believe from medical records, that's how his hepatologist also told me every time.
Okay. And this article that Mr. Steckloff was showing you, it actually says in the abstract, the last sentence is that data on the effect of sustained virologic response on the risk of EHMs are limited, and EHMs or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is included in that, right?
Yes, I can see that.
Okay, turn to page 14 of this article, if you will. There's a blue box, and it's called Significance of This Study. And this was written by the authors. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, and read the first bullet point under what are the new findings. Read it into the record, please.
Chronic hepatitis C infection.
No, I'm sorry, excuse me. Where it says what are the new findings, read the first bullet point under that one.
Compared to HCV-infected individuals who did not receive treatment, SVR attainment was associated with reduced risk of mixed cryoglobulinemia, glomerulonephritis, porphyria,
Put NHL.
non-Hodgkin lymphoma, diabetes, and other conditions.
Okay, so the important thing for the court reporter is that this article's authors just said that compared to HVC-infected individuals who did not receive treatment, SVR attainment, which was what Mr. Hardman had, was associated with a reduced risk of ... non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, correct?
That exactly supports my statement that I gave counsel.
Okay, no further questions.
Okay. You can point me to one thing in the article, and then I really have to go.
On page 7 in discussion. The authors explain, we observed that ABT with SVR led to a moderate reduction in risk of B-cell NHLs when compared to untreated patients. Then it goes on. Moreover, the benefit persisted after excluding individuals with HIV infection. But then it says, however, this risk reduction
Okay, I'm looking forward to reading more about this in your briefs, and thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Schustoff, and we'll see you again next time.